May 8, 1945. 2:17 p.m. A requisitioned estate outside Lüneburg, northern Germany. The boots were polished. That was the first thing the young captain noticed, not the iron cross at the collar, not the rigid posture, not the eyes that had commanded armies across 2 continents. Just the boots. Mirror bright, despite the dust of defeat, despite the rubble of 1,000 burned cities, despite the fact that the war had ended exactly 7 hours ago. The general stood in the doorway of what had been a drawing room and was now a makeshift processing center, his uniform immaculate, his spine straight, his face a mask of cold defiance. He did not salute. He did not speak. He simply stood there, as if daring the world to acknowledge that he had lost. The captain was 26 years old. He had been in combat for 3 years, had seen more death than most men twice his age, and had learned that dignity was not a privilege of victory but a discipline that survived even ruin. He looked at the general for a long moment, at the polished boots, the iron cross, the refusal written in every line of his body. Then he did something no one in the room expected. He saluted first. They had braced for confrontation. What they witnessed was restraint choosing its own authority. The sound came before the man. Boots on gravel, measured and deliberate, echoing through the courtyard of the estate that had been requisitioned by the British 11th Armoured Division as a temporary headquarters. It was mid-afternoon, the sky overcast, the air still carrying the acrid smell of smoke from fires that had burned for days. The war in Europe had ended that morning at 11:01 a.m., when the unconditional surrender took effect, but the machinery of war did not stop instantly. There were prisoners to process, units to disarm, territories to secure. And there were generals, dozens of them, stripped of command but not yet stripped of pride. The general who arrived that afternoon was a senior officer, a man who had held divisional command on the Eastern Front and later in the defense of the Rhine. His name does not matter, what matters is what he represented. He had fought for a regime that had unleashed catastrophe, had commanded men in a war of annihilation, had been part of a system built on cruelty and conquest. And now he stood in a drawing room converted into a processing station, facing a captain young enough to be his son, and he refused to acknowledge defeat in the one way that mattered to him, he would not salute. The room was crowded. British soldiers stood along the walls, clerks sat at makeshift desks sorting documents, and other German officers waited in line, subdued and silent. The general's arrival changed the atmosphere. He walked in as if he still commanded the space, as if the surrender was a technicality and not the end of everything he had fought for. He stopped in front of the captain's desk, clasped his hands behind his back, and stared straight ahead, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the room, beyond the captain, beyond the present moment. The captain looked up from the paperwork. He was slight, bookish, the kind of officer who had been trained in law before the war and had learned command through necessity rather than temperament. He wore the insignia of the Royal Berkshire Regiment, his uniform clean but worn, his face marked by exhaustion and something else, a weariness that came not from physical strain but from the accumulated weight of decisions made under impossible conditions. He studied the general for a moment, noting the refusal, the silent challenge, the boots that gleamed like monuments to a lost world. Then, slowly, the captain stood. He straightened his uniform. And he saluted, crisp, formal, military precision. The general blinked. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it was there. Surprise, confusion, and something deeper, a fracture in the certainty that had sustained him through surrender. He had expected anger, humiliation, contempt. He had not expected respect. He hesitated, his hands still clasped behind his back, his face struggling to maintain its mask. And then, almost involuntarily, his right hand rose. He returned the salute. Slowly. Stiffly. But he returned it. The captain lowered his hand, gestured to a chair, and said in accented but clear German, "Please. Sit." The general Saturday. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. The general had been captured 4 days earlier, near Bremen, as his unit disintegrated in the final chaotic days of the war. He had spent 32 years in the military, had risen through the ranks in an army that prized discipline, hierarchy, and an almost mystical belief in duty. He had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He had survived the brutal winters of the Eastern Front, the grinding attrition of the war's final years, the collapse of every strategic illusion that had sustained the regime. By May 1945, he knew the war was lost. But surrender, for men like him, was not simply a matter of laying down arms. It was an existential crisis, a confrontation with the fact that everything he had believed, everything he had served, had led to ruin. He had expected brutality. The propaganda had promised it, that capture meant execution, humiliation, slavery. That the Allies were vengeful, that defeat would be met with the same cruelty that his own army had inflicted across occupied Europe. When British troops surrounded his headquarters, he ordered his men to lay down their weapons and waited for the inevitable. But the inevitable did not come. Instead, he was disarmed without violence, processed without insult, and transported to a holding area where he was fed, given water, and treated not as a war criminal but as a soldier. It was the first contradiction. It would not be the last. The journey to Lüneburg took 2 days. The general traveled in a convoy of military trucks, crammed with other officers of varying ranks, all of them silent, all of them processing their own shock. The roads were clogged with refugees, displaced persons, and the remnants of defeated units wandering without direction. Towns lay in ruins. Bridges were collapsed. The landscape was a testament to total war, and the general, staring out at it, understood for the first time the full scope of what had been done in the name of victory. At a checkpoint, a British soldier handed him a canteen of water and a tin of biscuits. The soldier did not speak, did not smile, but the gesture was unmistakable, basic decency. The general took the water, drank, and said nothing. But he noticed. Every small act of restraint, every moment where brutality would have been justified and was instead replaced by procedure, chipped away at the certainty he had carried into captivity. By the time he arrived at the estate outside Lüneburg, he was disoriented, not by fear, but by the absence of it. The estate had been beautiful once. A manor house with high ceilings, parquet floors, and tall windows that overlooked gardens now trampled by military boots and vehicle tracks. It had been requisitioned within hours of the British advance, its former owners, minor aristocracy with quiet ties to the regime, relocated to a village nearby. The drawing room, where the general now sat, had been stripped of its furniture and converted into a bureaucratic nerve center. Desks lined the walls, filing cabinets stood in rows, and a map of northern Germany hung on the wall, marked with pins and chalk lines showing the disposition of surrendered units. The captain sat across from the general, a stack of forms between them. The process was routine: name, rank, unit, service history. The general answered each question in clipped, formal German, his voice devoid of emotion. The captain wrote carefully, his handwriting neat despite the fatigue visible in his posture. Neither man looked at the other. It was procedural, transactional, the machinery of war processing its final casualties. But then the captain paused. He set down his pen, leaned back in his chair, and said quietly, "You served on the Eastern Front." It was not a question. The general glanced up, wary. "Yes." "For how long?" 2 years. 42 to 44. The captain nodded slowly, as if processing something more than the answer. It must have been difficult. The general's jaw tightened. He had expected interrogation, accusations, perhaps even a confrontation about atrocities. He had not expected this, something that sounded almost like empathy. He said nothing. The captain picked up his pen again, resumed writing. "You'll be held here temporarily, then transferred to a longer-term facility. You'll be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. You'll receive regular meals, medical care if needed, and access to correspondence with your family, if they can be located." The general stared at him. "Why?" The captain looked up, confused. "Why what? Why are you telling me this?" The captain considered the question, then said simply, "Because it's the truth. And because you deserve to know what to expect." The general had no answer to that. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had signed orders, commanded men, made decisions that had sent thousands to their deaths. He thought about the boots he had polished that morning, the small ritual of dignity he had clung to as the world collapsed around him. And he realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that the young captain sitting across from him understood something he had spent 32 years refusing to see, that respect was not earned through dominance but through restraint. Behind the captain's decision was a structure, invisible but unyielding. The British Army had been preparing for this moment since 1940, when the possibility of victory was still distant and uncertain. A directive issued by the War Office in the war's early years stated, in language both bureaucratic and revolutionary, "Prisoners of war are soldiers who have laid down their arms. They are to be treated with the dignity afforded by their rank and in strict accordance with international law." It was not sentiment. It was strategy, security, diplomacy, morality. The triad was inseparable. A prisoner treated humanely was less likely to resist, less likely to incite unrest, less likely to become a rallying point for continued resistance. A camp that adhered to the Geneva Conventions provided moral authority in negotiations, ensured reciprocal treatment of British POWs held by enemy forces, and demonstrated that Allied victory was predicated on principle, not revenge. And an army that maintained discipline, that saluted even an enemy general who refused to salute first, proved that civilization was not a luxury of peacetime but a standard that could be upheld even in the chaos of surrender. The captain did not think in terms of policy. He thought in terms of duty. But his duty was shaped by the policy, and the policy was shaped by a vision of what a just war looked like. It looked like a young officer standing to salute a defeated general. It looked like the decision to offer dignity even when it had been forfeited. It looked like restraint choosing its own authority. The general was taken to a barracks on the estate's grounds, a converted stable that had been partitioned into cells with wire mesh and wooden slats. He shared the space with 15 other officers, most of them junior to him in rank, all of them silent and withdrawn. They slept on cots with thin mattresses, were issued blankets that smelled of mothballs and disinfectant, and received 3 meals a day, porridge in the morning, soup and bread at midday, and tinned meat with vegetables in the evening. It was more food than many of them had seen in months. On the first night, a British sergeant made rounds, checking that the cells were secure. He stopped at the general's cell, unlocked the door, and handed him a small tin. "Chocolate," the sergeant said in broken German. "Red Cross. You're entitled." The general took the tin, turned it over in his hands, and looked at the sergeant with something like incomprehension. "Why?" The sergeant shrugged. "Rules." It was the second contradiction. The day settled into routine. Roll call at dawn. Breakfast at 7. Work details in the afternoon, clearing rubble, repairing fences, unloading supply trucks. The work was not punitive, it was organizational, the mundane labor of maintaining order in the aftermath of collapse. The British Guards were professional, distant but not cruel. They did not taunt, did not abuse, did not exploit. They simply did their jobs, enforcing rules that applied equally to everyone, prisoner and captor alike. The general worked alongside younger officers, men who had been conscripted in the war's final years and had never known anything but defeat. They spoke little, moved mechanically, their faces blank with exhaustion and shock. But slowly, as the days passed, something shifted. They began to notice the consistency, the meals that arrived on schedule, the medical attention provided without hesitation, the guards who responded to requests with neither hostility nor subservience but with a procedural neutrality that felt, strangely, like fairness. One afternoon, while unloading crates of rations, a young lieutenant, barely 20, with a gaunt face and hands that trembled when he lifted anything heavy, asked the general, "Do you think they're going to execute us?" The general looked at him, then at the British corporal supervising the work detail, then back at the lieutenant. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think they are." "Why not?" "Because," the general said slowly, as if articulating something he had only just understood, "they are not us." The pivot came not in a single moment but in the accumulation of gestures that defied expectation. A guard lending a lighter to a prisoner who wanted to smoke. A medic treating an infected wound with the same care he would give to one of his own men. A clerk helping an officer draft a letter to his family, patiently correcting the English phrasing, ensuring the message would reach its destination. Each act, in isolation, was small. Together, they formed a pattern, a system of restraint that was more powerful than any display of dominance. The general began to notice other things. The way the British officers spoke to their men, firmly but without cruelty, issuing orders that were obeyed not out of fear but out of discipline. The way disputes were resolved, not through arbitrary punishment but through procedure, hearings, documented decisions. The way the camp was organized, not as a warehouse for defeated men but as a temporary holding facility designed to process human beings with some remnant of dignity intact. He wrote in a diary he had been allowed to keep, a small leather-bound notebook that he filled with cramped handwriting in the evenings. "I have spent 32 years believing that strength comes from dominance, that order requires fear, that respect is earned through force. I was wrong. These men, these British soldiers, have defeated us not because they were more brutal but because they were more disciplined. They have taken us prisoner not to humiliate us but to process us. They have fed us, treated our wounds, and maintained order not through terror but through consistency. I do not know what this means for everything I believed. I know only that I was wrong." One evening, 3 weeks into his captivity, the general was summoned back to the manor house. He walked across the courtyard, flanked by 2 guards who said nothing, and was led again to the drawing room where he had first met the captain. The captain was there, sitting at the same desk, the same stack of forms between them. But this time, there was something else, a letter, handwritten, lying on the desk. The captain looked up as the general entered. "Sit," he said, and this time there was no need to repeat the gesture. The general Saturday. The captain picked up the letter, held it for a moment, then set it down again. "We've located your wife," he said quietly. "She's in a displaced persons camp near Hanover. She's alive. She's asking about you." The general stared at him, unable to process the words. His wife. Alive. Asking. He had not allowed himself to hope, had not permitted himself to think beyond the immediate reality of survival. And now this young captain, this man who had saluted him when he had refused to salute back, was telling him that the one thing he had not dared to hope for was real. "We can arrange correspondence," the captain continued. "Letters, through the Red Cross. It will take time, but it's possible." The general's hands, resting on his knees, began to tremble. He clenched them into fists, trying to maintain control, but the mask he had worn since surrender was cracking. He looked at the captain, at the letter on the desk, and said in a voice that barely held together, "Why are you doing this?" The captain met his gaze, and for the first time, the general saw something in the young officer's eyes that was not pity, not superiority, but a quiet, unshakable conviction. "Because you are a human being," the captain said. "And she is your wife. That doesn't change because you lost a war." The general could not speak. He nodded once, a small, jerky movement, and the captain handed him the letter. It was addressed to him, in his wife's handwriting, the ink smudged as if she had been crying when she wrote it. He held it carefully, as if it might disintegrate in his hands, and then he looked back at the captain and said something he had not said to anyone in years. "Thank you. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe, the next scene will challenge you even more." The weeks turned into months. The general remained at the estate, along with hundreds of other officers awaiting transfer to longer-term facilities or repatriation. The routine deepened, became almost familiar. Work details. Meals. Roll calls. Letters. The British maintained order with the same mechanical efficiency they had brought to every other aspect of the war, and the prisoners, slowly, began to adapt to the strange reality of captivity without cruelty. There were tensions, of course. Arguments broke out over trivial things, rations, sleeping arrangements, perceived slights. Some prisoners clung to the ideology that had brought them to this place, muttering about betrayal, about resurgence, about the inevitability of a reckoning. But most simply existed, navigating the liminal space between the war they had lost and the future they could not yet imagine. The general kept to himself, working without complaint, writing letters to his wife, reading the books the British allowed into the camp, novels, histories, even newspapers, though they were weeks old by the time they arrived. He watched the younger officers, saw how they struggled with the cognitive dissonance of humane treatment, and he understood their confusion because he felt it too. Everything they had been taught said this should not be happening. And yet it was. One afternoon, while clearing debris from a bombed-out shed, the general worked alongside a British private, a young man from Yorkshire with a thick accent and a tendency to hum while he worked. They did not speak, they simply lifted, carried, and stacked in the rhythm of shared labor. At one point, the private paused, wiped sweat from his forehead, and offered the general his canteen. The general hesitated, then took it, drank, and handed it back. "Cheers," the private said, and resumed humming. The general stood there, canteen still in hand, and realized with a clarity that was almost painful, this was not strategy. This was not policy. This was simply a man sharing water because another man was thirsty. And in that small, unremarkable gesture, the general saw the foundation of everything he had failed to understand. That civilization was built not on grand ideologies or martial glory but on 10,000 small decisions to choose decency when cruelty would be easier. In early July, a Red Cross representative visited the camp, a middle-aged woman with a Swiss accent who moved through the barracks with brisk efficiency, checking conditions, documenting complaints, ensuring that the Geneva Conventions were being upheld. She stopped at the general's bunk, asked him a series of questions about his treatment, his health, his access to correspondence. He answered truthfully, the food was adequate, the medical care sufficient, the guards professional. She made notes, nodded, and moved on. But before she left, she paused and said, "You know, most of the camps are like this. The British, the Americans, they follow the rules. It is not perfect. But it is not barbarism." The general looked at her, this woman who had spent years documenting the reality of captivity across Europe, and asked, "Why?" She smiled faintly, as if the question itself was answer enough. "Because they believe that even in war, there are lines that should not be crossed. And because they know that how you treat your enemy says more about you than it does about them. She left, and the general sat on his bunk, thinking about lines. About the ones he had crossed, the ones he had witnessed others cross, the ones that, once violated, could never be restored. And he thought about the young captain who had saluted first, who had offered dignity when none was owed, who had demonstrated that restraint was not weakness but the highest form of strength. By August, the general had been transferred to a larger facility in the Rhineland, a converted factory where thousands of German officers awaited processing and eventual repatriation. The conditions were harsher, more crowded, more impersonal, the bureaucratic machinery grinding slower under the weight of sheer numbers. But the principles remained the same: order, procedure, adherence to international law. The guards were tired, the prisoners exhausted, but the system held. The general shared a barracks with 30 other men, most of them strangers. They slept in rows of cots, ate in mess halls that smelled of boiled cabbage and disinfectant, and spent their days in a kind of suspended animation, no longer soldiers, not yet civilians, caught in the bureaucratic purgatory of post-war limbo. Some men played cards. Some wrote letters. Some simply stared at the ceiling, processing losses too vast to articulate. The general did what he had always done: he worked. He volunteered for every labor detail, not out of enthusiasm but out of the need to maintain structure, to impose order on chaos. He repaired fences, unloaded trucks, sorted supplies. And in the evenings, he wrote long letters to his wife, shorter notes to himself, trying to make sense of what he had learned in captivity. One letter, written in late August, captured the shift. I have spent these months in a prison that is not a prison. I have been defeated but not destroyed, disarmed but not humiliated. I have been treated by my captors with a restraint I did not show to theirs. I do not write this to excuse what was done, nothing can excuse it. I write it because I must acknowledge the truth, that I believed strength came from domination, and I was wrong. Real strength, the kind that endures, that builds rather than destroys, comes from discipline, from adherence to principle even when it would be easier to abandon it. The British taught me this. Not through speeches or sermons, but through the simple, relentless consistency of doing what was right even when I did not deserve it. The moment of repatriation, when it finally came, was anticlimactic. A clerk read names from a list, and the general, along with 200 others, was loaded onto trucks and driven west to a transit camp near the French border. From there, they would be sent home, to a Germany that no longer existed, to cities reduced to rubble, to a future that was blank and terrifying. The general carried nothing but the clothes on his back, the letters from his wife, and the leather-bound diary he had kept throughout captivity. At the transit camp, he saw the captain one last time. It was chance, a coincidence of timing and geography. The captain was overseeing the processing, standing near the gate with a clipboard, checking names as prisoners filed past. The general waited until the line thinned, then approached. The captain looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes. "General," he said quietly. The general stood at attention, then, slowly, raised his hand in salute. The captain returned it immediately, the gesture crisp and formal. "I wanted to thank you," the general said in careful English. "For everything." The captain shook his head. "You don't owe me thanks. You were a prisoner. We had a duty." "No," the general said firmly. "It was more than duty. You gave me dignity when I had forfeited the right to it. You treated me as a soldier when I had served a system that deserved no respect. That was not duty. That was decency." The captain looked at him for a long moment, and the general saw the exhaustion there, the weight of 3 years of war, of too many decisions, too much responsibility. "We all make choices," the captain said quietly, "about what kind of people we want to be, about what kind of world we want to build. I chose to believe that even enemies deserve to be treated like human beings. I still believe that." The general nodded, unable to speak. He saluted again, and this time the captain returned it with something that looked almost like sadness. Then the general turned and walked through the gate, toward the truck that would take him home, toward a future he could not yet imagine. The general returned to a city that was no longer recognizable. His home had been destroyed in the bombing, his neighborhood reduced to skeletal walls and rubble. His wife was alive, living with relatives in a village outside the city, and they reunited in the kind of embrace that comes after loss too vast to quantify, not joyful, but relieved, grateful simply to have survived. He did not speak much about his captivity, not at first. But over the years, as Germany rebuilt itself from the ruins, as the war became history and history became memory, he began to tell the story. Not to glorify his captors, not to excuse his own role, but to testify to what he had witnessed, that in the aftermath of total war, in the chaos of surrender, a young British captain had chosen to salute first. And in that gesture, the general had learned something that 32 years of military service had never taught him, that respect was not something you demanded. It was something you offered. Even to those who had not earned it. Especially to those who had not earned it. He wrote about it in the memoir he published in 1958, a sober accounting of his service and his captivity. The chapter about the captain was brief, just a few pages, but it was the heart of the book. He described the polished boots, the refusal to salute, the moment of decision. And he wrote, "I expected contempt. I received respect. Not because I deserved it, but because the captain believed that civilization required it. He taught me that restraint is not weakness. It is the hardest form of strength. And it is the only thing that can redeem us after we have lost everything else." The captain, for his part, returned to England in late 1945, resumed his legal career, and rarely spoke about the war. When asked, years later, about the incident with the general, he dismissed it as routine. "It was procedure," he said. "We had rules. We followed them." But his daughter, sorting through his papers after his death in 1987, found a diary entry from May 8, 1945, written the evening after the encounter. "Met a general today. Refused to salute. I saluted him anyway. Not because he deserved it, but because I do. Because if I become the thing I am fighting against, then what was the point of any of this? The war is over. Now we must decide what kind of peace we will build. I choose to build one where even enemies are treated with dignity. Not because it is easy, but because it is the only way we remain human." If this story has shown you something about the war you didn't know, subscribe and share, because the hardest truths are often found in the smallest gestures, and the victories we remember longest are the ones where humanity refused to surrender. On May 8, 1945, at 2:17 p.m., a defeated general refused to salute a young British captain. The war had ended 7 hours earlier, but surrender had not yet reached the general's pride, his sense of rank, his refusal to acknowledge that everything he had believed was now ash. The captain could have demanded compliance, could have used his authority to force submission, could have treated defiance as insubordination and punished it accordingly. Instead, he stood. He straightened his uniform. And he saluted first. It was not strategy. It was not required. It was simply a choice, to offer respect even when it had been withheld, to demonstrate that dignity could be extended even to those who had forfeited it, to prove that civilization was measured not by what you did when it was easy but by what you did when it cost you something. The general returned the salute. Slowly. Reluctantly. But he returned it. And in that moment, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the architecture of what defeat could mean, what surrender could look like, what kind of peace might be built from the ruins of total war. The war had taught the general dominance. The captain taught him restraint. And restraint, in the end, was the only victory that mattered. The boots were polished. The salute was returned. And the world, however fractured, was slightly less broken than it had been.